Chapter 10 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 10. When Lyttleton stretched out his hand for a match to apply to his bedroom candle, it trembled a little. "He is partly right," said he, staring thoughtfully at the wick. "A mind made up is a force in itself. Now, I have never been able to distinguish whether the scene in the rectory garden was the beginning of the union of souls, or the precise reverse." He took up the candle, but did not move off. It guttered in his hand, and sent flickering lights and shadows about the room, while he mentally ran up and down every possible gamut of doubt and hesitation. The memory of the tumultuous heart beating, half pleasant, half painful, with which he had involuntarily greeted Honora's appearance in the hall still warmed him. He felt the attraction of a personality which could so disturb his own. At the same time, hearts are known to leap at the advent of a foe as well as of a friend. The great thing, thought Lyttleton, is to distinguish. Unlike his friend Sheridan, whose power of swift decision was a great saving of time and friction both to himself and others, the processes of Lyttleton's mind were not quick. He hung back from self-committal, and was far too prone not only to hesitation, but to going back on his own words and thoughts and discovering that he did not agree with them. Caution, in short, was a predominant quality, combined with an introspective turn, and it occasioned a slowness in his movements and exterior characteristics which was useful as modifying a tendency to be direct in manner, even to brusqueness. His conversation with Honora in the rectory had precipitated an event for which he had long been preparing. After that event he had not forgotten her, but had kept himself acquainted with her main movements, and unconsciously treasured every bit of news about her. Still, his mind had hardly as yet travelled beyond surmise. Those uncomplimentary words about her in the ear of his friend, marking perhaps its advance, as Sheridan had interpreted it, towards the stage of debate. For Lyttleton's anxiety and agitation had certainly at present no reference to a doubt concerning the state of Honora's mind towards himself. His heart history had so far not nearly reached such a phase. It was caused by a doubt about his own. In his opinion, the finding of any heart friend is its own reward, without the superaddition of crowning happiness, and it was quite within the quality of his hesitating character to plunge at last either in love or friendship with a generous rashness, and to hold to his choice with a self-respecting constancy regardless of return. The heart once decided, the mind made up, neither man nor woman, he thought, whatever the outcome, can fail to draw up precious rewards from this deliberate leap into human experience. "The first great thing is to discriminate," said he. "The second is a liberal venture." The banging of a door in some nether region of the house, and reverberating through all the sleeping stories, recalled him to his position, to the guttering candle, the extinguished fire and lamps, and the common custom of going to bed. He started and walked forward mechanically. The change of posture was accompanied by a determination to call on Honora, and see for himself to what phases of character an altered experience had brought her. As he slowly undressed, he asked himself whether he had behaved altogether squarely by her in concealing his own gradual change of view. Finally he came to the unusual resolve of making a full confession. It brought him into a great heat to think of it, for the unburdening of the mind was a difficult thing to this reticent man, particularly when he suspected that his confidence would be received without sympathy. Still, when he had once come to a conclusion, with him it was final. Besides, he argued, I am already found out. Leslie called at the High School after particular inquiries from Lucilla as to when the head mistress was likely to be in and at liberty. He was shown upstairs to her private room, and the door being opened, he caught a glimpse of a writing table strewn with books and papers, and the figure of Honora, familiar and yet unfamiliar, bending over it with rather dishevelled hair. He had an impression of a good deal that was tasteful and womanly in the room, and of a green plant or two throwing a cool shadow. Honora turned at the opening of the door. Mr. Lyttleton's name was announced. "Oh!" cried she, springing to her feet and standing quite still to stare at him with burning cheeks and a face full of memories. Leslie advanced into the room, and immediately and unconsciously, and in a very pretty feminine manner, she put up both hands to smooth her ruffled hair. Leslie's eyes, smiling and softened, followed the movement of the hands. "How do you do, Mr. Lyttleton?" said Honora, recovering herself suddenly and taking a step towards him. "Please sit down." Her eyes shone a little. Leslie seated himself, and she took a chair opposite. After her multifarious experiences in London, she remarked the rough coat and wide boots less, and the kindness of a friend's face more. "It is a long time since we met," said Leslie. "Is it?" said Honora. "Unless you include the other night, of course," he returned hastily. "You were at the lecture." "So were you," retorted Honora, blushing. "I came in ignorance with a friend." Leslie perceived that they were already in antagonistic attitudes, and launched upon a conversation that seemed likely to prove a fencing match. But he was not ill pleased. It had a flavour of intimacy, but it was inviting rather than dangerous. He was bent upon discovery, and also upon that more serious experiment of confession, and he wished to avoid all emotion. A surprising realization of her beauty and wholesomeness seemed to threaten him with difficulty on that point in the first moment. "Well," said he, slowly and carefully, "to tell the truth, I am always there." "That surprises me," returned Honora, as gravely as though he had owned to some wrongdoing. "Oh! Why should you feel surprised at it?" "Because I thought the lecture detestable, and the debate noisy and absurd, though there were some clever speeches, of course." "I'm afraid I must confess myself in agreement with the tendency of thought even in the worst speech," returned Leslie, doggedly. "Is that so?" "Yes, it is so." Honora leaned forward in her chair to look at him more closely. "Does this mean that you are a declared Socialist?" "Yes," said Leslie, "it means that." Honora turned her head away and stretched her hand towards a vase full of chrysanthemums and autumn leaves, touching and rearranging the blossoms with a preoccupied air. She wished to accentuate her detachment from any personal concern in Mr. Lyttleton's affairs, but her lips were closed in disapproval. "Let me try and relate my experience," said Leslie. "Certainly," said Honora, placidly. Leslie would have given something for a warm and encouraging glance. He felt that he needed his confidence to be met, taken by the hand, and run with all the way. But he received nothing of the kind. He was conscious of a painful difficulty in beginning, and spoke, in effect, throughout to a slightly flushed cheek, a handsome coil of hair, and fingers glancing through the flowers. He told her of the half unconscious changes that had been initiated within himself even while at the university, and of those private studies which had resulted in a silent though profound revolt against the official economics taught there. Something of this revolt, he said, had lain at the bottom of his refusal of a fellowship and of his determination to find independent employment in London. He informed her that he had set himself to seek information concerning the new school of economists rising just then into notice and influence within the metropolis. This new school struck him as a necessary growth thrown off from the soil of the city. He saw it as an indigenous product of thought, from the mingled constituents that make up London, from the depths and heights of life, the immense scope and variety of experience, the jostling within its circuit of every gradation between the extremes of cultivated existence and of dolorous disease. "It could scarcely surprise me," said he, "to find how many young and audacious thinkers had thrown their ability and vigour into this line of thought. Neither could I wonder at the originality with which they touched their subjects. Fresh as I was from Cambridge, it came to me indeed as an unloosing of bonds. How could their thought be anything but fresh and true, when it fed continually on the changing aspects of the real life that lay close to their ordinary everyday existence? I felt inevitably it must succeed, because it had life in it. It was a genuine utterance to meet a genuine need. I saw from the very beginning that they were winning and must win their way. One day," he continued, "I heard for the first time a lecture from Paul Sheridan, our friend of the other evening. In him I saw indeed a son of the city's soil, and what more widely human can we find than a mind that has within it so much of the essence of a great city? His faith in the redemptibility of his fellows, his determination to compass it, if it might be to give up his life to working to that end, not philanthropically, not in any benevolent fuss, but out of the force and directness of his thought and character, all this, together with the heart of truth in his arguments as to workable methods, won my conscience and established an influence over my actions. I sought and made his acquaintance. I suppose that from this particular lecture onwards my course was shaped towards one day throwing in my lot with him and his colleagues. But, Honora, it was your telling me your father's story that finally and irrevocably clenched my resolve." This was the moment for the scales to fall from Honora's eyes. She reread the interview in the rectory garden at a glance. When she realized how futile her appeal had been, how ludicrously mistaken, she experienced a sharp stab of pity for her bygone self. After one vivid blush she became paler. "Is this altogether kind?" she murmured. "I was not perhaps quite square with you in the past. I am trying now to make amends," said Leslie. "Thank you," said Honora, coldly. It was her bit of revenge to put aside the interesting topic of her own feeling as irrelevant. "Now tell me," she continued, "is this on your part irrevocable?" "Yes," he replied, "irrevocable." Then she withdrew her hand from the flowers, turned her head, and looked him in the face with a full and deliberate scrutiny. This, she reflected, was the second man who within the year had confided to her ear a recital of his experience. What had taken them that they danced after will-o'-the-wisps in this fashion? On another count she was perplexed. When one has black-marked an opinion with one's own discredit, it is not an uncommon error to suppose that one's friends will show timidity, or at least a delicate reserve, in owning up to it; that they, at any rate, will have the civility to hedge and prevaricate. No hint of the kind was in Leslie's manner. Just now, indeed, as her scrutiny continued, he responded by an open-eyed smile. "Am I forgiven?" said he. "Oh, yes," she returned. "But you know, all that you have been telling me sounds rather vague, and I was utterly unprepared for such a disclosure." "You were surprised, then, to see me at the lecture?" "Indeed, I was surprised. Not only so, it was a shock. Dear me, the whole thing struck me as an absurd and noisy scene. And to see you there, you, sitting and ringing that little bell." Her tone changed suddenly from icy placidity to warmth. "Well, yes, I do sit there sometimes and ring that little bell, when it is useful. But what did you think of the lecture?" "I think that it is easy to be effective when the matter is inflammatory," said she. "As to the lecturer, I consider him detestable. He made me furious. Lucilla introduced us afterwards." "Why, what is that?" "His manners, to be sure." "I always thought Sheridan particularly courteous." "Oh, dear me, nobody likes to be made of no account." "I am sorry if he offended you. Had you said anything?" Yes, which he immediately proved to be foolish. Leslie laughed. You ought not to complain of that. Why should you object if he puts you right? Honora sniffed. Leslie pulled his moustache, while his eyes laughed above it. How about the Greek myths? Said he, to change the subject. Gone, with a good deal of other absurdity, said Honora valorously. Lost and mislaid in this workaday world. At this moment Lyttleton fancied that he suddenly saw round the baffling corner of her nature, and his heart bounded pleasantly. "Your present position suits you, then?" he asked, eager for further discovery. "Very much so indeed. Let me tell you that I like the independence of it." She settled herself in her chair and turned her head in a self-possessed manner. She wished him to know that she could do without him quite well, and should never appeal to him again. No, that opportunity was dropped irrevocably into the region of the lost, gone for him for ever. "Never mind me," she added, as one who can afford to belittle herself. "Go on about this Socialism of yours." Leslie returned to the subject nervously. This independent woman was a different creature from the girl who had tried to coax him into helping her to achieve mere notoriety. He found her much more powerful and impressive, and admired her more. Let anyone exchange affectation for reality for ever so short a time, and it will be found instantaneously effective. "What more have I to say?" he replied. "Really, Honora, I have made a thoroughly clean breast of it this time." "But I want to know all sorts of things that grow round about it. I'm sure your motives are all right, of course, but I'm nothing if not practical, and I want to know what it all tends." "Oh, I don't know that I can prophesy." "Well, just tell me this. Was that gathering last night a fair sample of a Socialist audience?" "I think so, yes. Sometimes you may get a more turbulent assembly, of course." "Dear me! Does it strike you that there was any infusion of conceit?" "Probably. Why not? It generally sounds conceited when people very firmly say what they know they want and what they are determined to get." She smiled musingly. "People are so accustomed to hearing others hedge and defer to authority," he added. She had her hands now on either arm of the chair, and was moving her palms slowly over the smooth surface. Her head leaned back. She was looking at him under her eyelids. "You talk so differently from what you used to do," said she, in a low, rich voice. "Do I? Perhaps I am changed. I think you, too, changed, Honora." "You know," she continued, "I used to think there were such ambitions open to you." "Did you, indeed?" Leslie shook his head with rather sad-eyed firmness. "Of course there may be something more in this Socialism than appears. If the Socialists, for instance, became a great political party." Leslie laughed. "We are a mere handful," said he. "A handful of determined men can move the world." "That is so at times," he said. "Honora, are you hankering after the theatrical effect of a violent revolution?" "Only if successful," she replied promptly. "What an extremely feminine idea this is," said Leslie, musingly, and crushing his soft hat in his hands. "The revolution or the success?" "The violent revolution." "I assure you at once I do not want anything of the kind. But I do like things to be practical and successful. I can see no use at all in vague ideas." "Do you not? I think they form the ground for action in the next generation. I'm afraid I hardly care to be general servant to posterity." "You want to rule in this?" said Leslie, smiling. "Of course I do. And you? You might be a great leader, I suppose, since you have chosen this path." "I? Nothing of the sort, I assure you, Honora. There never was a more mistaken idea." "Then I give it up. This is indeed a visionary vision. I don't understand in the least what you are driving at, or why you have adopted it. I consider it all highly unsatisfactory, Leslie." Lyttleton sat silent, smiling rather absently. He was noting that she had called him by his Christian name, but the tones of her voice seemed rather to indicate an assumption of equality than an access of tenderness. "I suppose," she continued, "I shall learn more about London in time, this queer, queer London. I believe it to be full of cranks. As for myself, frankly, I am absorbed in my work." Still, I will get Lucilla to take me about with her and show me things. Lucilla belongs to London, as the Gammonds belong to Paris. I suspect that she is a crank too, but I love Lucilla." She threw her head back and laughed. The laugh is the point of danger. But Honora looked a very comely creature, laughing thus musically and gently, with flashing white teeth between her lips. Leslie was a little sore at the cheerful indifference in which his solemn confidence had been received, but her presence, her atmosphere, cheated him at last even out of that sensation. There was, he felt sure, no quarrel between them now, and that at least was a satisfaction. "So you do like your work? You are content?" he said, as he rose, his grasp tightening nervously on his hat. "I like it, and I am content. Oh, how very, very angry I was with you! But after all, you were right. How furious one is with the person who is right while one is wrong! But it is all forgiven now. I have found my fitting place. The work, as far as I myself go, is precisely what suits me." The voice was brisk and decided. Laughter was still in her eyes. He smiled as he took her hand and murmured that he would see her again. But once outside he became grave and asked himself whether he had made the least progress in his journey of discovery. When he had gone she gave a little skip in the air and clapped her hands above her head. She looked all joyous life and girlish beauty. The ripples of her laughter seemed to run over her figure. On the whole, she was very much satisfied with herself and with the interview. After so many humble dishes it had been a tasty thing. Moreover, she had learnt new and interesting facts about herself. The meeting with Leslie revealed the advantage she had gained through her firm step into independence. "Why, of course," she cried, "I belong to myself now exactly as he belongs to himself. There is not that to choose between us." Here she snapped two pairs of white fingers over her head, her uplifted face laughing between. "I need not ask him, nor father, nor any one. I am what I am, and can stand to it." End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 11. Honora's friendship with Lucilla prospered. On her side it was very tender, stronger, and deeper than any emotion she had as yet experienced. While submitting herself in a quite extraordinary way to the spiritual and intellectual guidance of her friend, her own superior physical strength and her strong common sense caused her to assume a protective attitude towards her. She took to watching over Lucilla, and as the weeks went on she detected a growing pathos in the eyes of the latter, a shade of trouble on the brow. Whereupon her thought turned to the portrait she had seen on the wall of her friend's sitting room, and she laid up a second grudge against Mr. Sheridan. In effect, however, she scarcely gauged the situation. Nowadays the original theme between the sexes is played with variations. One evening, not so long after the lecture, Lucilla sat solitary in her workman's flat, expecting Sheridan's visit. Sheridan had thought of her pale little face with a good deal of kindness ever since the evening of his lecture. He had spoken the simple truth when he told Lyttleton he had no clue to her depression or her change, and now he determined to find time in his growingly busy life to try and put things right if he should find that anything had gone wrong. That was how it came about that Lucilla was expecting him. She had thought of his visit all day, and now listened for his steps with ears in which the silence throbbed, sitting with hands clasped round her knees, her head a little bent, thinking, dreaming. Lucilla had the gift, a very rare one, of tasting the imaginative in everything. Existence was something that she realized, not as Sheridan realized it, with a perfect genius for seizing the practical turn of events, but on the less tangible, less visible side. It was not only thus with her own life, but with all existence. For her a wonder rested on the day. It was never a commonplace thing with her to look into the face of another, to hear the voice of another, to receive even moderate confidences. She was intensely responsive to, and conscious of that principle of continuity and oneness that may be philosophically observed and argued about, but which is rarely an ever-present reality to the mind. Most people lose this particular flavour of things in preoccupation with details. Possessing the exceptional power, Lucilla was not often dull and lonely, though occasionally, through over-capacity in sympathy, a little melancholic, and again suffering sharply through her tendency to throw her own baffling dream over those to whom her affection clung. She was dreaming now, and mingling the greatness of her cosmical idea with the personality of the practical man of affairs who was at the moment mounting the steps to her flat. When his knock came, she went to open the door with a tumultuous heart and a subdued face. It might almost have seemed that Sheridan, on entering, should have caught some departing rustle of the wings of Lucilla's thoughts. But he had come to her straight from the busy workaday world, and the noise of it was still in his ears. All he noticed was the girl's familiar form, the light of the room behind her dark head, and the beginning of a dry smile on her lips. As he entered, he wore the wistfully friendly smile with which it was natural to him to try and amend for any hurt which he suspected but could not understand. From his lips, however, only commonplaces fell. No one could be more open than he when he liked, but he had his reticent side and would feel his way with a difficult subject. Lucilla occasionally thought that they took refuge in commonplaces from something of import that lurked on the edges of either mind. "I have brought you the proof of the last leaflet," said he. "I thought you might like to see it." "Thank you," returned she, a little crestfallen, while he searched in his pockets. "It represents a good deal of hard work," he remarked, as he handed it to her. "Ah, yes, I am sure of that if you have had to do it. People will say it is a dream." "Dream or no dream, within 6 months they will have adopted it as practical politics." Lucilla was fingering the pamphlet absently. "That's how we get on," said she, permitting the dry smile to escape her. "Of course, by sheer iteration. You repeat and repeat a thing until it sticks, and then people imagine they've said it themselves all along." "And forget the source of the idea," said Lucilla, regretfully. "Oh, that doesn't matter," he returned, with his friendly smile. But Lucilla was turning the pages and glancing between them with a face which Sheridan interpreted as one of distaste. "I'm afraid it's rather dull," said he, apologetically. "Paul," said the girl, shyly, the colour mounting to her cheeks with the effort of the words, "I wish you'd read something of mine." Her glance avoided his, and her heart was beating. The moment the words were out, she wished them unspoken. "Of yours, Lucilla?" said Sheridan, leaning forward with his kindest smile. "Have you been writing?" "Oh, no, I don't mean that. I haven't time even to think of such a thing, you know," she returned, withdrawing her hand nervously from his pamphlet. "What is it, then?" he asked, rather coldly. "Well, this." She pushed forward a rival pamphlet. Sheridan took it up and dropped it again with a sour look. "Achille d'Auverney" was the name written on the cover. He handed it back to her side of the table, turned his head from her so that only the profile was visible, and drummed on the table with his fingers. "I don't think this sort of thing is any use," said he, very gently and very firmly. "You won't read it?" "No." "Why not?" "Because it's waste of time." "Paul!" "Yes?" "May I read you a little?" "Certainly, if you wish it." She took up the paper with shaking hands. Her throat was dry. She moistened her lips. Then she began. "It must be war to the knife. Neither concession nor compromise is possible. Set yourself against everything established, because everything that is established is a lie. The only truth possible to you is the attitude of the destroyer. On no excuse will you become the servant of the system, nor clothe yourself with tyrannical power under the fiction that you are representing another. All offices, all elections are a lie. If you climb, you do so by treading on the necks of your fellows. You make a ladder of souls. In all things you must be the equal of others. Property you must repudiate. Do the bourgeoisie respect it who thieve from you? Personal appropriation is not. All things are common to all men. Your right is everywhere. All things are yours. In the heart of a sphere of lies grows up this truth, irresistible, ominous, and soon it will burst it asunder." She broke off suddenly. Sheridan sat immovable, except that he had courteously left off drumming on the table. "Oh, dear!" sighed Lucilla. "Well?" asked Sheridan, without turning his head. "I can't read. Something cold takes hold of my throat when I try to. I think it is because of you." "I'm sure I'm very sorry. I was listening. What more can I do? But I feel you don't like it." "Then, Lucilla, why do you try and read it to me?" The girl sighed rather fiercely. "I'm reading it because I like it. You've no idea," said she, in a low, struggling voice, "how difficult it is, how very difficult it is for me to differ from you." Sheridan turned his face round suddenly. It was full of a very cordial and helpful friendliness. "I am really sorry that you like this stuff," said he. "Oh, it isn't stuff. You are prejudiced against M. d'Auverney." "Not a bit of it. And perhaps I should not have said I'm sorry you like it, so much as that I am sorry you attach importance to it. To me it reads like a string of irrelevancies." "Does it?" "Certainly. I can detect nothing practical in it at all." "I think d'Auverney meant it to be an ideal principle, a guide." "Very well, then. That makes me suspect him. A man who speaks of being in all things equal with others, and that everything that is established is a lie, is talking nonsense, and probably knows it. But the rest? It is all mere claptrap. If Her Majesty sent for d'Auverney to morrow in order to bestow office upon him with a view to his bringing in a bill for the nationalization of the land, would he call that treading on the necks of his fellows? And do you suppose he would refuse?" "I firmly believe he would," cried Lucilla, quite loud and with a spark in her eye. "Then he's neglecting his duty." Lucilla laughed in spite of herself. Sheridan echoed it. The laugh eased the growing tension between them. Sheridan leaned over the table with his friendliest smile. "You tell me it is difficult for you to differ from me." "Ah, yes. Why should you try to do so, then? It argues that you don't really differ. If you did, it would be easy." Lucilla's lips parted and closed again. A sigh escaped her instead of the reply for which he waited. "I don't care for the bourgeoisie," he continued. "A Socialist is in effect of no class. But I would suggest to you that it is just as criminal to be too much before the time and to try and force action upon it for which it is not ready, as it is to be behindhand and to attempt to retard reform. Besides," he added, and now he was tugging at his moustache, "it is absurd. Let d'Auverney try to administer the affairs of the smallest office and realize the complexity of the interests involved before he clamours for a clean erasure." Lucilla tossed d'Auverney's pamphlet, which was entitled "Down with the Bourgeoisie," aside. "Paul," said she, springing up suddenly with quite a changed air, "I've been trying to put together a little notice of the coming lectures in the local papers, and I can't do it a bit. My head aches after correcting all my school work, and I feel almost imbecile." "Hand it over to me," said Sheridan, beaming kindly. "Can't I put it together for you? I've got time." He glanced at his watch. "Now? How good you are! Here is some paper and the beginning I made." She brought it to him, and as he drew up to the table, stood leaning over his shoulder and pointing things out to him with her fine little finger. "You see, I meant this and that," she said, "and it wouldn't come into shape." "All right," said he. "I see. I shall bring it out straight presently." Lucilla left his side. She pushed a low stool to the hearth and sat down on it, leaning her head on her hand. The light from the lamp fell on his notable forehead and strong face. Trifling though the task was, he accepted it with all his heart, and was soon absorbed and writing away rapidly, pushing the pages aside as they were done, stopping now and then to make an erasure and to touch his moustache thoughtfully, as though it helped his ideas, but going on again immediately. Now and then he sighed. Lucilla, her cheek burning under her hand, watched him all the time he was at work, dreaming meanwhile dreams that were utterly alien from him. To the surface observer, the thoughts of these two comrades of the Revolution were but two sides of the same thing. In reality there was between them the possibility of opposition more irreconcilable than between them and their common foe. "There," said Sheridan, tossing aside the last sheet and smiling to find the large-eyed gaze upon him, "there's a handsome advertisement, if you want one." "Do you know," said she, "your face keeps reminding me of something." "And what is that?" said he. "Something in nature. You make nothing of nature, never see it, I believe. Yet your face reminds me of a mountain I once saw. It was one of the range of hills that lay opposite the windows of a house where I was staying. The sun set over them. This hill was shaped differently from the rest. It had the aspect of the face of a man lying upwards to the sky, and it changed like a face does. That was, I suppose, just atmospheric effect, the passing of cloud and sunshine, but it gave me the feeling of a vast silent communicativeness. "Lucilla," said Sheridan, gently, "I'm afraid I don't understand all this poetry. The only poetry I can see is that which one puts into everyday work and life." "But you'll let me tell you?" "Yes. Oh, please do go on." His face cleared and softened. He had given up some of his precious time to help this strange little creature in her incomprehensible difficulties, and he was not going to be balked of his intention. "There were two ideas that I always associated with the hill. The features were curiously like yours — like mine. And I could never look at it without the idea of democracy springing unbidden to my mind." "Indeed! I think I can understand that." "But I wanted to say this," the girl's voice shook. "In the face of the mountain was something that is lacking in yours." "Well, Lucilla?" It was impossible for him to keep a note of dryness from his tone. "Oh, nothing at all. You lack that single quality. I know it, and it vexes me." Sheridan moved rather uneasily in his chair and tugged at his moustache in desperation. The girl's tone had been so gentle and pleading, he could not but be touched by it, and it felt that her sensitiveness had shrunk from something in his own. He turned his face towards her again, and that with his inimitably sweet smile. "If you are going to bring me to book for failing to carry out a chance resemblance to a mountain in every particular, I am sure I shall not know how to answer." "But, Paul, I found the difference typical." The girl's voice was sharp with pain. "All right. Where am I in fault?" The tone was not in the least nettled. It was interested and kind. If Lucilla could widen his sphere of self-knowledge, she was by so much more his friend. There was no one who suffered less from diseased vanity than Sheridan. "Is it faith that you want?" said she. "I shouldn't have said so," he returned. "Then why do you rely so much on opportunity? Why don't you make a way yourself?" "I should have thought that was the chief sign of my faith. My opportunism is a lively symbol of it. What I do is to trust and to follow on, to dream that my dream lies within my opportunities, and to seize them." "But it makes you lack the great quality which makes a great leader," she persisted. He reflected on the words with a shade of amusement in his eyes, detecting an image of himself in her mind to which his consciousness did not altogether correspond. "I begin to suspect that the missing quality is the sublime," said he, chuckling. "Whoever said I was to be a great leader?" She looked at him reproachfully. "Pray, who has decided that I am to be great?" "I am," he continued, with that genuineness whose infusion into his nature made his power more powerful, "merely a man of detail and resource." "You can do what you like," she returned, in a low, hurried voice. "A man like you — a man like you —" "No, I can't do what I like," said he, his face assuming an aspect of deep perplexity. "That is your want of faith," said she. She was gazing at him with glowing eyes, but the eyes of her mind were fixed on something beyond. Lucilla's was the naked, daring dream of sheer revolution. She was ever in suspense for the tremendous word which would transfigure life and place that revolutionary notion of hers within measurable distance. She oscillated between these moods of suppressed expectation and the everyday depression on which she expended her dry smiles and sarcasms. If Paul would only utter that word, would give that signal, and from him she would have it come, and not from another, there was nothing she would not do, no rash leap in the dark she would not have taken under his direction. But would he utter it? In knowledge of the world, Lucilla was a mere dreaming baby, a child with a fairy tale, and she really believed that Sheridan had this in his power. "I have it in my heart," thought she, "but I have no voice. He must be the voice. It must come from him." Meanwhile, Paul, uneasily suspecting an overestimation of his power, sought a reply which should be at once true and kind. "I see you are labouring under some mistake concerning me," came his composed tones in between her thinking. "But I am not under an error as to myself. I know what sort of a mind I have." Expectation had not yet gone underground. She waited for more. The silence began to have a particular intensity. Turning his head, he caught the glow in her eyes and smiled. "I believe you want to die heroically in Trafalgar Square," said he, suddenly inspired. "Now that marks the difference between us. I am simply engrossed in working out that matter of the gas and water." He spoke jokingly, but was startled to see the sudden blanching of her face. "Oh," said she in her driest voice, "you'll do very well." He leaned towards her inquiringly. "Oh," she added, lowering her eyes and fighting with a rising sob, "you will succeed all right." "Shall I?" said he very gently. "Of course I should be glad of that." But so commonplace a thing as success was not only no part of Lucilla's ideal, it was not permitted to it. Paul stepped down from his pedestal when he said he should be glad. "Why, yes," said she, "you'll get on." "I can't help wishing for recognition, of course," said he, looking at her in grave surprise, "but only if it is part of a larger success. I assure you of that, Lucilla." "Oh, yes," said she, putting her hand up to her throat. "I don't think I am quite following you," said he, with rather pathetic friendliness of manner. "Perhaps not. Oh, I daresay there is nothing to follow." "You'll read the pamphlet, won't you?" said he, kindly. "Look here, if you've got all these copy books to correct, I might leave you the proof a day longer. I want your opinion on it, you know." He pointed to the heap of school work as he spoke. Her heart fluttered in her breast. His kindness chained and subdued that larger passion which it harboured, that cosmical emotion. Once she had connected it with his personality alone. The habit of reference to him was still strong, but change and rebellion were already at work. If she had spoken, the words would have run into an entreaty for a more exacting claim upon her allegiance. "Don't give me kindness," she would have said. "That way you trouble me. Say something rousing. Call me to do something." But Sheridan made no such claim, had no such idea. These moods of Lucilla had indeed an annoying side to the strong man of plain affairs, but she was his friend and comrade, and he had a great, kind patience. Indeed, his gentleness deepened as her face blanched more and more. He would have given much to assuage the hurt which he perceived without comprehending. "I promised to call round on Lyttleton. He is hard at work just now on the sketch of a Factory Act," said he, making a new effort to interest her. "Yes, I hate a Factory Act," returned Lucilla, who yearned to hear that the planet was in a blaze. "Do you? I am sorry for that, because I think it important. Well, good bye. I suppose I must go. I speak, by the way, from Platform 5 on Sunday in the Park." "I like these great assemblies of the people," said she, firing up. "When I touch them I touch reality. I am safe with them. I have my true place among them. I am afraid neither of their vice, their roughness, nor their disease." "I don't believe you are, Lucilla," said he, cordially. "But I must be off to my work." He took her hand, holding it warmly. "I wish I could have helped you more. I daresay I've said the wrong thing. Do forgive me. Well, I've no doubt I shall see you in the Park." He looked at her with kind consideration. He met a strange, solemn gaze that startled him, and dropping her hand, he withdrew. CHAPTER 12 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 12. Sheridan descended the steps more slowly than was his wont. He was baffled, pained. He knew that he had failed, and he could not understand the reason of his failure. In the sitting-room Lucilla stood where he had left her, lost in thought, her hands folded, her head bent. She was not listening to, and therefore did not hear, the slowly descending steps echoing on the stone staircase. But this was not because Paul had dropped out of her mind the moment he had withdrawn from her sight, but because he was so intimate a part of the mental struggle in which he had left her, that she was unable to occupy herself in the exterior matters connected with him. She was no mere girl in love to run to catch a departing glimpse of the person of a lover. That was not the relation between the two. Their tie was the tie of comradeship. Preference there always must be, whether between man and man, or man and woman, in the love of comrades, as in other affections, the heart of the one feeling after that other who can best respond to its individual quality. Such preferences enhance the common joy in the union effected through a simultaneous surrender to a distinguishing thought, a thought which singles out a few and impels them together, and apart from others, in a great coincidence of aim and idea. But it is not the private preference, it is the coincidence of aim, which gives the touch of tragical earnestness to the tie, the idea in common lifting the personal relation to the level of a great allegiance. Paul, walking down the stairs towards the street, carried with his personality an inseparable impress of the communistic dream as it existed in Lucilla's mind. But the socialistic idea stood to her like a lonely forest tree, vast, unencumbered, stark, and without the chance of comparison with kindred or lesser growths. Now Paul, as a man of the world, threaded every day an intricate way amidst a crowding multitude of competing ideas, and measured his own notion with them. For a man thus plunged in the tides of life about him, it was almost impossible to realize the single-eyed preoccupation with an absolute idea which a great-hearted girl in her restricted life might cherish. On her side, it was unlikely that she should understand the apparent modification of his attitude in face of a complex reality with which she never came in touch. Her crying need was to keep the beautiful idea intact, to divide it with none, to compromise in no particular. Its very extravagances were precious to her. Now Paul met these dryly. He did not sneer. He simply laid them aside as useless to the work in hand. This was mere evidence of his strength and sagacity, of his accurate measure of the possible. Yet Lucilla was chafed by it and disappointed. In reality he was a no less far-reaching dreamer than she was, but he bore his dreams and not they him. He built warily about them and netted them in the practical. The one tremendous test of character is to harbour a dream sanely, and not to be driven by that disquieting and inimitable presence beyond our poor necessary limits out to the unguided impulses beyond. Unfortunately, rashness and prominent self-sacrifice were to Lucilla necessary constituents of virtue, and the growing success of Paul's method and that of his friends in procuring a wide recognition of Socialism was slowly awakening discontent in her heart and undermining its trust and allegiance. Was there not elsewhere to be found a more complete correspondence between the inner ideal and the outward form? Standing motionless, the better to fix her mind on its torture of irresolution, this was the question she debated. Her heart, in its furious beating, keeping pace with the oscillation of her thought between impulse and inaction. It was as though Sheridan, who by this time was turning out of the building into the street, was carrying away with him and further from her best safety and highest self-possession. Presently he reached the end of the street and turned into another which led in the direction of Lyttleton's chambers. At that moment, remembering his errand, he shook himself together, dropped Lucilla and her moods out of his mind, and stepped briskly forward. Had his engrossment with her, his regret and commiseration, acted as a mesmeric or telepathic power? For in the same instant the girl, starting from her absorption with a sigh, ran to her bedroom and came back with a hat and cloak in her hand, which she flung about her person in a great despatch and hurry, as though she feared the impulse to action might die out unfulfilled. Then she ran to the door. Her fingers were upon the handle when she hesitated again. An extreme pallor marked her face. Her eyes wandered over the homely little chamber, the glances touching familiar things, quickly and as quickly passing away from them. Finally they were arrested by Sheridan's portrait. She stared at it fixedly. Some vague presentiment, a warning, a silent reproach went out from it. She withdrew her hand from the door. Her fingers sought the clasp of her cloak as though to unfasten it. Would that some infallible guide were with us to direct even our fine impulses in their oscillations between action and refraining, and their choice between the double currency of silence and of speech. How much more those of our rasher and less honourable hours. The next moment the door closed behind her, and she was running in wilful haste down the stairs. The direction in which Lucilla turned was opposite to the one Sheridan had taken, and finally she hailed an omnibus marked Westminster. Quarter of an hour later she was walking under the shadow of the Abbey, and then towards the bridge. Her steps were swift. She hurried along without observing much, and yet the feeling of the place and of the night was with her, so that on reaching the bridge she paused, as she was to pause many and many a night hereafter, and laying her hand on the stonework looked towards the east. Her eyes were full of a great and passionate yearning. She scarcely saw the lights, or the gleam of the water, or the shaping of the buildings into fantastic shadows by the darkness. She saw only her own dream. Across the dream hurried processions of miserable ones, of outcasts to whom earth and life had been cruel, of shreds and remnants of humanity who did not taste of joy. Hunger and cold, disease, crime itself were there. All that the eye of her mind beheld she unshrinkingly embraced without offence, without hesitation. Her single desire was to find that way by which consecration of her life to their help might be most complete, most entire. Her pause was scarcely more than momentary. She went quickly on, and passed into a shabby street, where presently she reached the house she looked for. By the time her hand was raised to the knocker, nothing of her late turmoil remained save the sad sense of being alone and without the faces of her comrades about her. The shadow of evil presentiment, that future running with its ominous warning finger into the hour of the present, had withdrawn. The mere fact of decided action had resulted in a sense of assurance, even of a pleasurable appreciation of the thrill of adventurous existence. In answer to her knock, the door opened almost immediately, and a shabby man of extremely foreign appearance, smoking a cigarette, thrust his head forward. He gave a start of astonishment when he saw the slight figure standing outside. This obvious surprise was for the moment a little dismaying to Lucilla, who remained speechless upon the threshold, while the foreigner peered at her curiously and suspiciously. An impulse from the orderly habit deeply rooted in her girl's life tugged, as it were, at the very skirt of her dress. She had almost turned to flee as suddenly as she had come. Unfortunately, she stood her ground. "Is Monsieur d'Auverney here?" faltered she. "Ah, you are one comrade?" And without pausing to hear her reply, he went to the bottom of the stairs and called the name of the Frenchman. The next moment d'Auverney, who had advanced from the second story, was running down towards her with outstretched hand and a vehement welcome on his lips. "Yes, I am come," gasped the girl, as he stooped forwards to look inquiringly into her wide open eyes. "I am come after all, only to see, though. After all, I am not satisfied." "Come upstairs," was d'Auverney's reply, "and let me introduce you to the comrades." Meanwhile Sheridan was in Lyttleton's rooms. The two friends were seated at a table piled with papers, blue books, law books, and books of reference of various kinds. The work in hand was that of drafting for Parliament a new Factory Act. The idea was Sheridan's, the scope, the measures of the bill were his, but many of the clauses and a good deal of the wording were Lyttleton's. This joint sort of labour was common to Sheridan and his friends, who, throwing their time and effort into the common stock, lost the identity of any particular literary hand or personal suggestion in excellent collective results. On the present occasion neither Sheridan nor Lyttleton ever expected to have their names mentioned in connection with the work they had in hand. Sheridan, to begin with, had found a sympathetic member of Parliament who had fallen in with the projected scheme, and had willingly consented to put his name on the back of the bill when it was ready, and to introduce it to the House on as favourable an opportunity as the Government would allow. The member, Mr. Martin Inchbald of Welshire, offered suggestions, and would probably make alterations, but his stipulation was that he should be spared the sacrifice of time necessary to the shaping of such an act into proper legislative form. In every other way he was in thorough agreement with the pair, and a willing co-operator. Sheridan's next care had been to catch the ears of a few members whose sympathies leaned with his desires, but who were either lukewarm in the matter or doubtful as to the practicality of the projected legislation. Many and long had been his conversations with these hesitating souls. His handling of their respective personalities had been an inspiration of deftness, and his arguments far too adroit and ready to be easily parried by the breathless and often half-informed legislators who eventually capitulated to his attacks. For at the back of the man's felicitous skill with his fellows was always that sense of genuine and lofty will, that fire-spot of enthusiasm which carried the day where lesser methods might have failed. The most onerous part, the sketch and elaboration of the bill, had still to be accomplished, and this was the business before them. Neither man had the least expectation of success in the passage of the whole bill through a House in which a Conservative government was in power, and neither of them was in the least dashed or injured in his energy by the certainty of its defeat. But they did cherish the hope that some of their clauses might be accepted as amendments to the Government bill. There are now a handful of members, all more or less able speakers, who have pledged themselves to the measure, said Sheridan, his hand moving rapidly between paste pot and scissors, and that is a forward enough step for the present. Some of them at least are bound to hit upon the right arguments in the process of debate. At any rate, I've coached them assiduously. The great thing is to bring the idea of this particular line of reform before the House and to get it talked about. By the way, I had a letter from Inchbald the other day. He thinks we do not make sufficiently clear what are the separate provinces of the sanitary and factory inspectors, returned Lyttleton. We must mark that out a bit, then. I want to lean towards extending the factory inspectors' powers, and I thought I'd made that clear enough. Hand me the old act, will you, and our first draft of this one. Sheridan, at work upon this serious bit of state business, was not a whit different in attitude or manner from what he had been in Lucilla's room. He wrote with the same rapidity and complete concentration, now and then saving time by the scissors and paste pot expedient. The word seemed to leap to his thought. Occasionally he rather testily rejected some suggestion of Lyttleton's which he considered ill-advised. At others he accepted one in preference to his own, with a lightening of his own face to his companion's idea, and a short exclamation of "That's it." Frequently he ruthlessly and unhesitatingly effaced phrases of his own or of Lyttleton's that did not commend themselves to his mature judgment, with a quite impartial disregard of the vanity of either. It was about a quarter before midnight that he suddenly threw down his pen and turned towards the clock. He stared at it with an absent and harassed glance, so that his friend suspended his own work also to look at him. "Lyttleton," said he, still unconsciously staring at the hands, "there's one thing in addition to all the rest that's becoming more and more self-evident to me, and that is that we've got to fight the Anarchists." "Very well. But what makes you think of it now?" Lyttleton also dropped his pen and leaned back in his chair. Sheridan did not reply. He still gazed meditatively and absently at the clock, with a peculiar falling away of the lines of his strong face into a sensitive and commiserating look, as though some idea had stirred his heart suddenly to the deepest feeling of pity. "You know," pursued Lyttleton, seeing that his friend did not respond, "there is, in my opinion, a certain amount of truth in Anarchism. Just enough to make the lie more fatal." "And what makes you feel to night that we must fight it?" "Merely a clearer apprehension than usual that it is the shortest cut I know of to reaction. If you want to point me out the genuine enemy of practical Socialism, show me an Anarchist." Lyttleton pushed the papers aside and took out a cigarette and lit it. After a reflective puff or two he looked again towards his friend. "It will never take much hold in England," said he. Why are you alarmed? It's the sort of thing that lives by persecution. And you see we just let it alone." Paul was still looking straight before him with that gentle commiserating look. A little before this hour the door of the house into which Lucilla had vanished reopened, and she issued from it in company with half a dozen men and a sprinkling of women. She turned quickly and without even nodding good night in the direction of the bridge. D'Auverney followed her, but she did not remark it. It had been very great, very inspiring, this talk with the Anarchist comrades. Her spirit was full of soft o's of excitement. Her cheeks burned and her eyes gleamed like the reflections in the water upon which presently they were fixed. Was it indeed possible that those stern barriers of time and circumstance and inertia which daily throw back zeal and determination to the attitudes of vigilant waiters upon opportunity could be broken down by the resolute action of a few staunch companions? She leaned her arms and body upon the stone and abandoned herself to reflection. Daring emotion thrilled every nerve as though with some intoxicating stimulant. To be in active conspiracy against society, not as Paul was, living in it, adopting its methods and turning them against itself, but in very actuality to exist as its deadly foe. Such a conception came as an offer of emancipation to her conscience and her heart. Extreme and sudden steps have this joyous feel. We appear to be bounding into liberty and have no suspicion that bondage may lurk at the end. She panted with longing for some such instant release and self-realization, for a plain straight way in which her feet might run without this harassing sense of doubt and groping. Paul had once laughed and said that the cry for assurance about our actions was like the cry for assurance of immortality. But if every one, for instance, would but simultaneously fling themselves upon the right. It was curious that at the moment an old phrase of Paul's ran inconsequently into her mind from some recess of memory. "Too much is involved for us to dare to be hasty, Lucilla. It is our duty to examine and to test, to study and to vigilantly watch for and seize opportunity. That is the true attitude of right citizenship." She almost heard the grave musical voice and saw the kind eyes bent on her in the old familiar way. That sudden vivid presentation of her friend arrested her with the sense of something homely, comforting, and safe. And just then the hour of a quarter to midnight chimed from Big Ben. She started and raised herself from her leaning posture with a curious sense of sudden awakening. D'Auverney, seeing her move, advanced quietly. "I was waiting until you were roused from your absorption, mademoiselle," said he. Lucilla turned. The voice, polished and attuned, fretted her with a sense of incongruity. Looking up to him, the foreign, handsome face with its large and luminous smile, its dark smile as from dark eyes and hair and skin, came to her with a startling sense of strangeness. Unconsciously she straightened herself and drew her cloak closer about her, and then, withdrawing her eyes, fixed them on the darkness of the river across the bridge, dotted with indistinct lights. "Monsieur d'Auverney," said she, in a slow, soft voice, "you must not think too much of my having been here to night. It has been very refreshing, a great uplift, but nothing is very clear to me just yet." The foreigner's eyes rested on the fine little profile, on the face full of possibilities of truth and devotion, scarcely shadowed out from the surrounding darkness. "Oh, no, mademoiselle," said he, gently. "I would rather you examined and proved yourself first. But it is a step," he added. "What is a step?" "It is a step to have you here on this bridge," he said, sharply, "under the shadow of those pretentious and accursed buildings, and debating whether you will continue to throw in your adhesion there," and he pointed to the Houses of Parliament, "or with us and suffering humanity down yonder." And he threw out his hand with a swift, expressive gesture towards the east. It was very well done, and it was obviously sincere, but it happened to be an error in tactics. Lucilla turned proudly aside, an indignant tear in her eye. "You mistake me," she returned. "I am debating nothing of the kind. We don't belong there in Parliament at all. It is only that I have not left the old comrades yet." And she took a step onwards. D'Auverney moved to her side quickly. "Permit me to accompany you home," said he. "No, thank you, no," said she, very rapidly and firmly. "I would rather be alone. I am accustomed to find my way by myself." A horror of his company seized her. She stepped forwards hastily. Indeed, her eyes were overflowing with tears. No great emotion brought them there. It was a sense of homelessness, a yearning for the faces of old friends. All the excitement and light and thrill died suddenly out of the evening, and left her feeling as a child might do who, under some terrible fairy enchantment, wakens to find itself upon a new hearthstone, with a circle of new, strange faces in the place of the old brothers and housemates. For, after all, it is the affections that give acuteness to the great allegiance. Chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 13. Paul Sheridan was undoubtedly a profoundly disagreeable person. Complacency had no chance with him, and complacency was, in consequence, furious. Honora, for instance, found it extremely difficult to pardon him for his conversational method. Lyttleton insisted upon bringing him to call, though Sheridan himself was alarmed and protesting; and afterwards a series of pleasant supper parties were arranged with the object of introducing Honora to the Socialist circle. Honora made 2 or 3 discoveries in the course of this experience. In the first place, that the Socialist circle had a vivid and easy charm of its own, which agreeably distinguished it from other society; in the second, that it obviously included some of the most advanced thinkers of London. Indeed, it had quite an extinguishing effect upon her university recollections, that past whose intellectual brilliancy she had believed could scarcely be repeated. Again, she discovered that the possession of an university education and a first class in classics by no means necessarily made her a match for the members of it. "Really, Lucilla," said she, some 3 months after Lyttleton's first call, "I feel that I am being put through a course of intellectual gymnastics. Now, my ideal of conversation has always been to have a distinguished man in a corner to myself, a man who will talk brilliantly, but who will never forget to introduce a soothing compliment every 2 or 3 minutes. I like to be sure that I am not being ignored." Lucilla's lip went up. "That isn't Mr. Lyttleton's style, is it?" asked she. "Not of late," said Honora, slowly. "It used to be something of that kind. As to Mr. Sheridan " "What of him?" "Conversation with him resembles a game of skittles. I am the skittle, you understand. He is the ball." Lucilla, comically smiling, thought she could follow Honora's meaning. Indeed, Sheridan's conversation was apt to be dotted with figures. He would use them to meet vague, clever sounding generalities, introducing them side by side with quotations from the poets in a juxtaposition which struck Honora as strange, and certainly not in the best classical style. In truth, the food for his imagination lay in the commonest things. He required no more than the everyday affairs of an everyday earth to set his heart a work on its lifelong labour of divination. The poetry he read out of a factory or a workshop was not a mere fanciful appreciation of the packed life beating in a multitude of individuals between 4 walls, the superior person detecting for verse-making purposes the picturesqueness of destiny working itself out in many closely adjacent lines. No one ever had his nose less in the air than Sheridan. It was that to his divining eye the commonest things told the deepest earth histories. The rhythm of his poetry had in it the fall of hammers, the hum of wheels, the ceaseless tramp of the workers' feet, the rattle of traffic, and the rush of steam. As the genius of the historian out of broken pottery and scattered shreds revives the palpitating life of the long dead city, so he out of figures would extract the passionate realities and tragedies of present existence. Your truest poetry is found in statistics, he would say. But if his poetry was not that of the superior person, neither was his point of view that of the commercial soul. The bigness of figures as representing production stirred him chiefly in reference to distribution, and high results in profits agitated him very dubiously indeed. He had indeed a way of perusing figures from a point of view terribly human and embarrassing. And he would mention his facts, publish them, talk loud and long, some people thought, and have intolerably insistent devices for creating uneasiness. A good many persons thought him impious, a larger number called him conceited, and those who could conveniently do so without drawing too much attention to themselves named him charlatan and fool. But the commoner folk saw that their bed and board, their nights and days, their food and leisure were in question. Some of the uncommoner kind, who had never been found in a tight fix as to bed and board, discovered themselves to be notably disturbed in the higher parts of conscious existence. The firm outline of Sheridan's thought had the comprehensiveness of a simple thing, so that many looking into it found themselves startled by meeting therein, as in a mirror, the starved eyes of their own ideal. It was, of course, evident to serious readers of history that Sheridan and his friends had not so much started an original line of thought as revived a perennial agitation in the very hour when it was likely to be successful. What they had indeed done was to cut, as it were, a channel between a landlocked country and a sea, down which the long travelled ventures of dead men, fleets of thought sent out in prior times, might sail tranquilly into haven at last. If any one had told any of the pompous products of English wealth and respectability, who were scandalized at the rumours of London Socialism, that to a certain section of the English revolutionary party Sheridan's method represented a compromise with officialism, a surrender of principle to expediency, even reaction and retrogression, they would have been lost in amazement. Nevertheless, such was the case. There are ever some outrunners of even the advance guard of thought, who carry the fire-tipped torch far ahead, and having long outstripped caution and slow-paced success, look back on the army coming into possession with beckoning hand and angry eyes. It was shortly after Lucilla's Westminster escapade that Lyttleton gave the first of the series of supper parties on Honora's behalf. Lucilla was present, of course, and very much to Sheridan's satisfaction appeared to be her old gay self again. For Lucilla, when untroubled by the too deep stirring of emotion, could be as careless and light-hearted as a child. Apparently, for some reason, she had set aside that rather tumultuous mood in which he had last found her. Honora, puzzled at her surroundings and just a little suspicious, and on her dignity, was secretly the mark of some kindly banter and amusement on the part of the friends. She felt herself to be certainly in society of a kind, but there hardly appeared to be opportunity for that distinguished bearing which she had hitherto connected with her idea of a circle. Lucilla fairly startled her into naturalness when, after supper, and they were gathered round the fire, she prettily entreated Lyttleton to spare her a cigarette. Honora could scarcely believe her eyes and ears. "Oh, Lucilla, my school," murmured she, with irrepressible spontaneity. Lyttleton's hand jerked with amusement as he handed Lucilla a light. Honora's handsome eyes were round and solemn and frightened. Sheridan chuckled audibly. "We'll engage not to tell," said he. "I hope you do not make too many sacrifices to the respectable," said Lyttleton. He was standing by her side for the moment, his hands thrust in the pockets of his short coat. He was full of a joyous warmth at having her in his chambers, face to face with his own friends and his own life. A more than ordinary vitality was shaken out of him, and expressed itself in quicker movements and a more rapid, brighter expressiveness than was his wont. It overflowed in the colour and changes of his face. Honora, looking up to him, unconsciously sparkled under his irradiation. "Oh," said Lucilla, puffing away manfully, her fine little nose in the air, "I assure you we have to be extremely smug. It isn't our own consciences we are cherishing, of course, nor even the consciences of the children. It is the consciences of all the parents." "That's an uncommonly long sick list, I fear," said Sheridan. "But I object to smoking," said Honora, firmly. "Lucilla, I am horrified. Leslie, I wonder you allow it." "Lucilla, give me that cigarette back," said Lyttleton, extending his hand. "Indeed, no," said Lucilla, putting him aside. "I never said that Honora and I had to cherish each other's consciences. You must know," added she, turning to her friend, "that cigarettes and early rising are my favourite vices." "I am sorry to hear about the early rising," said Paul, "because that argues a poverty in resource." "It is only an excuse for gross idleness during the day," said Lyttleton. "Oh, I'm no great sinner," returned Lucilla, "on either count. I'm always too tired for the one and too poor for the other." "Still, to prevent accidents, we might as well introduce it into the Socialist basis that every one shall abjure early rising," said Lyttleton. "As a virtue," put in Lucilla, "and breakfast at 8 o'clock." "I don't know what you're talking about," said Honora, indignantly. "I think your world will be in a very great muddle." "The servant," said Sheridan, suggestively, "always gets up first." "And nobody counts it to the kitchen for righteousness," put in Lucilla. "Don't mind them," said Lyttleton, in playful confidence to Honora. "We are bound, are we not, since we don't possess much solid virtue, to put in a little embroidery somewhere?" "It would be amusing," said Lucilla, "if we could play post in earnest for a month or two, and everybody take some other person's position. How abjectly helpless many of us would be!" "Now that would be an excellent thing," said Sheridan, "only I should extend the period. It would prove very selective, for one thing. I've been working on the subject of our public schools lately. They appear to me to be establishments designed for keeping many middle class lads out of the manual labour they are fitted for." "Now that would be an excellent thing," said Sheridan, "only I should extend the period. It would prove very selective, for one thing. I've been working on the subject of our public schools lately. They appear to me to be establishments designed for keeping many middle class lads out of the manual labour they are fitted for, and denying chances to the fine talent below languishing for want of opportunity." "I should have thought," said Honora, severely, "that with compulsory and free education, and such a code as I find is permitted by the Education Department, that the chances were pretty equal already, and that it was exaggeration to speak of talent languishing for want of an opportunity." Sheridan turned quickly towards her. She was warned by the not uncourteous light of amusement in his eyes that something was about to shoot from his lips which would be extremely disconcerting to a distinguished woman. "I am surprised to hear you say that," said he, promptly diving into statistics. "Let us take London alone. Only 1 out of 40 London boys continues his education after the age of 12. 50,000 leave school every year, and only about 1,000 go on to secondary education. Do you call that any opportunity at all? The majority of the juvenile population in our unorganized system of education are sacrificed while a small minority learn, or neglect to learn, at their expense. Such a state of things would not be permitted in a state based on social equality. "Do you mean," said Honora, "that you would take away the opportunities of those who rightfully possess them in order to hand them to others?" "Not at all. I deny that one small section has the right any more than another. All the same, what I desire is simply equitable distribution of chances. Joy in widest commonalty spread, instead of special appropriation." Here Lyttleton, who was accustomed to read Honora's face, interposed to save the conversation, which seemed to him like to pass into the condition of a half capsized boat whose sails have got unmanageable. It was an ironical revenge of circumstance and time that Honora, who had cherished disdain — a very filial and gentle disdain, of course — in regard to her father's mental position, thinking of herself as a whole generation ahead of him, should discover a certain coincidence of idea between him and Sheridan. For Sheridan, however little she agreed with him, could hardly be described as other than abreast of his age. Now Honora was conscious of feeling chronically shocked. His profane intermeddling with settled topics, university subjects too, struck her as turbulent. Secretly she classed him as a riotous person, gentlemanly of course, which made it all the more insidious. In his proximity she was uncomfortably suspicious that her mind and opinions assumed an antiquated air, or at least one of middle age, as though a cap and mittens had somehow got into her very constitution. From the date of the first supper party at Lyttleton's chambers, Lucilla to all appearance recovered her normal state of mind. During that evening her manner to Paul, with all its gaiety, had been a little timid and yielding, as though conscious of having given him cause for affront. "Good night, Paul," said she, in her softest voice, when the hour for parting arrived, and she and Honora were muffled up for their return journey. And Sheridan, delighted to see that she had thrown off her mysteriously dark mood, considered his injuries already atoned for. During the half year that followed she seemed to win back more and more to happiness in the natural routine and satisfactions of her life. As far as the school work went, she had never flagged in zest and energy, but during this time she threw herself again into line with Paul and Lyttleton and their friends, following on with the general effort apparently without a repetition of mental uneasiness. And during this time Honora's acquaintance with the Socialist circle proceeded side by side with her successful energy in the school work. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Transition. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Transition by Emma Frances Brooke. Chapter 14. Thus things went on until the early summer came round, and then it happened that a great popular demonstration was to be held in the park. Lucilla, as the occasion approached, arranged to go down beforehand to sell Socialist literature to the folk. This was much to the scandal of Honora, who, though her opinions upon most subjects were being modified, held to her main position tranquilly, with the fine staying power natural to her. When the particular Sunday afternoon arrived, Leslie called on her so early that lunch had hardly been cleared from her table. He waited at the door of her sitting room, apparently too much pressed for time to sit down. "Come with me into the park," said he. Honora hesitated and looked perplexed. "There is a great gathering there, a demonstration of the sweated. You have never seen these things, never been touched by them. Come and take your experience," he insisted. "Lucilla Dennison has already gone," said Honora, yielding. It was a lovely day, one of those gracious spring days which grow more beautiful towards eventide. The heat was unusual, so that the very sounds partook of it, but in the topmost branches was a little stir of wind, a gentle rustle that surprised one with a reminiscence of the solitude of woods where the flowers are not so much looked at nor the ways too much known. Honora and Leslie arrived before the processions and the wagons, but already there was a rising hum of noise. There were vendors of cheap ices, of lemonade, and dubious appliances for thirsty, dusty throats, and there was the inevitable nut which forms the dry excuse for the remedy. Also there were vendors of literature more inflammatory than the nut. In the course of their perambulations they stumbled across Sheridan, who also had come early, and who stopped them for a moment with a pleasant greeting and a word. "Where are the hosts of my indignant countrymen?" said he. "I thought I was to begin addressing them at 3:30." One after another various Socialist friends accosted them. "There is Lucilla Dennison selling pamphlets," exclaimed Honora, in a shocked voice. "What shall I do? Supposing any of the parents were to appear?" "I don't think you need fear that," said Leslie. "And besides, it is Sunday, when—" "Yes," said Honora, seeing his smiling hesitation, "when we might rest from the labour of keeping everybody right by our own particular standard. But look out, Honora. Stand aside a little." There was the crash of very lively music and the sound of a multitude of feet. Honora's first glance at the approaching procession, which swept on with a rhythmic precision of aim to its right station in the park, saw it as merely a gay picture of coloured banners and moving people. A second disclosed something not so charming to the eye and senses. It was Sir Thomas Browne, who said that at a solemn procession he had wept abundantly, and in the English spectacles is often matter and to spare for tears even from hearts less sensitive and tender than his. This was Honora's first glimpse of a representative gathering of the overworked and underfed, of the English device in pageantry with which we make glorious the streets and parks on a summer's holiday. She and Leslie were standing so that the procession headed straight towards them. Honora herself, in her handsome, well-developed womanhood, becoming at once the focus of 100 pairs of haggard eyes, and when it paused at the foot of a platform, the banners being furled and the music stopped, behind and still behind, over the shoulders of the foremost, swept up and pressed new waves of faces, until a compact mass of beaten and broken humanity was gathered together, waiting with uplifted heads for such crumbs of hope as the speakers might bestow upon them. Leslie had drawn Honora close under the shelter of the wagon. He felt her clasp his arm nervously with both hands. "Oh," she murmured, "what is the matter with them? What makes them look like that? Are they all ill, all together? What does it mean?" Her grave, scared eyes were moving over the faces of the crowd. "I'm afraid it is their normal appearance," answered Leslie. "It means that they are habitually overworked and underfed, and that many of them, whenever they have an opportunity, take refuge from despair in vicious excess." "It is shockingly ugly," murmured Honora, "and heartrending. I can't see a single face that does not look as though some injury has been done it." "Come away," said Leslie, "and let us go to some other platform. I think Sheridan speaks from the next one to this." Sheridan was already up in the wagon with 2 or 3 Socialist friends about him, and some well-known trade unionists. He was standing to the front of the platform, preparing to address the closely packed audience beneath him, and he had removed his hat so that the fine, generous lines of his head were thrown into bare prominence against the clear spring sky. Lyttleton piloted Honora to where she could hear him, protecting her as well as he could against the pressure of the crowd. Sheridan by this time had begun to speak. He did so with more than his usual incisiveness, a wind of energy, as it were, in voice and face. The audience were listening with rapt and critical attention. "They have a wolf in their eyes," said Honora, "as though they might spring on him and worry him in a moment if he said anything wrong." "Do not be afraid," returned Lyttleton. "I think you may trust both them and him." The wrong of the sweated was that which had perhaps most deeply touched the heart of Sheridan, and he had thrown much time and effort into a study of the subject. Whatever he now said was touched with that kind of emotion which has both energized and steadied itself by a hard-headed examination of the causes of a particular evil and the remedies that may be applied. He did not hesitate to appeal to a sense of injury in the hearts of his hearers, or to anything else that might rouse them to indignation, resistance, and the effort of self-deliverance. That kind of siding with the oppressor against the oppressed, which takes the form of timid silence, was not the kind of prudence to find favour in his eyes. "I am sure he is stirring them up to anger and rebellion," remarked Honora, rather indignantly, to Lyttleton. "I hope so," briefly responded Leslie. So far Sheridan's speech, though not unrimmed by the large and golden promise of Socialism, had chiefly confined itself to specific remedies which might be applied in the present condition of society to the mitigation of present suffering. He had been answered by approving murmurs, which broke out every now and then hoarsely and briefly from some rough throat of the crowd. "I have told you," he was saying now, "that what we Socialists want is to put an end to the great contrasts of this vast city, to level up and to level down, and to throw a broad and widening benefit into the middle streams of life, wherein the best strength of the nation is gathered. We want to pull the so-called residuum up into this, and so to order things that the chances of their falling out again shall be minimized to the fewest possible. We don't want to have this splendid park and those surrounding blocks of roomy and handsome houses perpetually contrasted with miserable patches in the City of London, representing congested districts of people who live in a soul-destroying struggle on the line of bare subsistence, and dwell in conditions which render decent family life impossible. We are able now to tell with mathematical accuracy how many millions in this England of ours struggle to keep the breath in their bodies at this bare life level. And in this London of ours, this city of dreadful night, we are able to tell the exact amount of misery, despair, disease, and vice in any given locality. We can make no longer an excuse of ignorance. Out of the population of this London of ours alone 300,000 families — families, mind you, not persons — are condemned to a life of chronic want. Now that this is so is a national shame and a national disgrace. It is our great defeat. We have had soldiers who have led our armies to deathly victories that have made noise enough in the world. Let some great statesman come forward to lead us to a victory that will bring life and not death along with it. For that we have in London alone these 300,000 families existing in an extremity of poverty presents to our legislators a state of things which it is their business to put right. At least, to begin with, let the government put its own house in order. Let the departments at least fix the wage of their employes above and not below subsistence level, and thus at least avoid demoralizing whole families of the workers and creating a new generation of the unskilled. But we must understand this." Here Sheridan's voice suddenly changed its note. "Socialism is not a system for easing one class, not even the working class, at the expense of the welfare of the rest of the community. It is not a hocus pocus for turning the misery of the East into the luxury of the West, or the West again into the East. We do not want to transfer the relative positions of these two separate and in many senses alien cities. To do that would be to do nothing. What we propose to do is to build, as it were, a new London, a new England, in which no rights of whatever the class is shall be recognized save those rights which are directly conducive or at least subordinate to the welfare of the community. We do not promise you things that are either impossible or unfair. We do not, for instance, promise you, as our Anarchist friends, I fear, do, to abolish rent. If you tried to abolish rent, you would simply give to the individual what should belong to the community. We do not expect to put an end to the wage system. Our object is rather to extend it to all. But we certainly aim at procuring for every worker a fair return for his labor, and a fairer share in the leisure and good things of life. And since these things cost money, we aim at putting into our national treasury that part of the collective wealth which is to be traced to no man's skill or enterprise, but which is the slow and vast result of the whole collective progress. This unearned increment, as it is called when we have come by our own, will furnish the government with cash to pay their employes better and to increase the inspection of the workshops, and to carry out the crying reforms I have indicated, and many others besides. But if I have told you where the necessary cash is to be obtained, it is you who must furnish our legislators with courage to take it. If you will not come out of your inertia and despair and indifference, it is not likely that the government will stir. If you will not put on citizenship enough to keep out of the public house and attend the polling booths at every municipal, school board, and parliamentary election in order to return the men whom you will force to pledge themselves to reforms of the kind, it is no use our urging on the reforms. More than this, and above all, you should drill yourselves until you are able to work together harmoniously. You will be strong just so soon as you press for reform in a solid body, and no sooner. You will get proper representation in Parliament when you combine to return your own leaders and stick to them loyally, and no sooner. Again, you should step out of that isolation which leaves you not only a prey to the greed of the employer, but to each other's necessity, and postponing the small and doubtful benefit of the day to the larger hope of the morrow. You must band yourselves together in a strong organization of your trade. Fight the blackleg in yourselves, and put on the new man of the trade unionist, is my last word to you." The speech had ended in a vigorous sermon, with certainly a sting to the tail of it. Honora was rather surprised when, on Sheridan's retiring to the back of the wagon immediately on having spoken the last words, a hoarse murmur of approbation broke out, which finally terminated in a ringing cheer. The audience had recognized a texture of homely truth in the speaker's words, and the average Englishman, especially fellows of the hungrier sorts, seasoned to woe, prefer truth and resent specious lies. It was unflattering, certainly, but the conscience was purged, the hope fortified, and the personal endeavour braced. Honora, looking round her with ever deepening interest, thought that beneath this sweet spring sky, and upon this spreading green, palpitating now with the tread of thousands of weary feet, was a gathering nearer in kind to the folk moots or wittenagements of old than might be found within the close halls of Westminster, and that possibly from voices such as Sheridan's, and from rough responsive throats such as these of the audience, came the genuine expression of that will of the nation which is predestined to become its law. "I want you to look at Lucilla Dennison," said Leslie, suddenly recalling her attention. Glancing in the direction he indicated, Honora caught sight of Lucilla walking alone on the outskirts of the crowd. She was not any longer selling pamphlets with her pretty animated air. Her hands hung empty by her sides, and her face was pale and anxious. She had a strange, isolated, melancholy look. "I am sorry to see her like this," said Lyttleton. "Sometimes I am irresistibly reminded by that girl of an overcharged Leyden jar. I feel that she overtaxes herself, and at any moment the delicate nature may break under the strain of emotions and ideas too great for it." "Lucilla is very prosaic sometimes," returned Honora. "Just now she certainly does look like a devotee, or something of the kind, but in school work she has an admirable practical talent." "The Anarchists are hanging round somewhere, I expect," muttered Lyttleton. "They always disturb her. I do wish she would leave off hankering after d'Auverney's claptrap, and stick to Sheridan's lead." Leslie, in spite of his brusqueness, was tender to women, and he was watching Lucilla now with uneasy compassion. Instinctively he glanced back for Sheridan, but could not see him. When his eyes returned to Lucilla, she was still pacing slowly up and down. Suddenly, however, he saw her stop and turn, and then, like an arrow, she sped in a particular direction of the park. At the same moment both he and Honora became aware that the crowded audiences were breaking up on every side, and that an ugly and more or less universal rush was being made towards the same quarter to which she had run. From that particular spot the sound which had attracted the people from the platforms reached them now. It was discordant and hideous, a slowly gathering roar, like the howling of wild beasts, full of hunger and rage. "It is only the crowd booing some unpopular orator. I assure you it's nothing. There's more sound than fury," said Leslie hastily, seeing Honora turn white. "But Lucilla," she replied simply. "Why did she go there? Please come with me. I am going to follow her." "Whew!" cried Leslie, as they ran along. "I'm afraid it is something ugly. The police are coming out of the lodges. There's Sheridan. Let us follow him." The rush of a crowd, when it is amiable and cheering, is it not a very pleasant encounter? But this howling anger appeared to Honora as something horrible. There was a tempest of rage and noise and movement under the quiet spring sky, a centre of genuine struggle with ever widening circles of curiosity and excitement. To plunge into the middle of it was the instinct of the male; to watch the melee as close, and only as close, as is consistent with separation from the fray, was the nature of the female. As Honora and Leslie came up to the scattered outside circle, the former looked everywhere for the slight girlish figure of Lucilla. She was nowhere to be seen. Could it be that she had improvidently and strangely cast herself into the centre? At first all that Honora could make out from the scene was an indistinguishable mass of people surging hither and thither. Then there came to her the sense of thousands of feet pressing and treading together in a single direction, and last the strange effect of thousands of excited faces straining with eager gleaming eyes towards one particular spot in the centre, and there the scrimmage, whatever it might be, was taking place. In the outside rings was booing enough and to spare, an infection of noise passing from throat to throat. There was silence and the tug of war. "Don't you be alarmed," said Leslie, a spark of masculine joy at a row royal in his eye. "It's an English crowd and a mere matter of fisticuffs." Honora stretched her neck and looked hither and thither. "It's them bloomin' anarchists," said a big policeman in answer to his inquiry. "Sunday afternoon 'ud be all Bible readin' and pipes for the force if it warn't for them furrin jackhasses." And he pushed his way in, handling his truncheon and ramming his big shoulders like a good-natured bull at all the weaker vessels. "Here come the mounted police," said Leslie. "It'll all be over directly. Stand a little aside, Honora, and you'll see the fun." Throwing himself close to her as a protection, he was a little surprised to feel her strong, lithe figure quivering from head to foot. But when he glanced anxiously at her face, he discovered that to be perfectly composed, save that her eyes darted hither and thither in the same intent search. The easy, measured beat of the hoofs of half a dozen horses, mounted by policemen, now came over the turf, the little troop setting itself straight on to the surging mass of human beings with an apparent recklessness that made Honora shiver again. "They will trample the people down," she murmured in a low, tense voice. "Oh, dear, no," said Leslie. "Don't you be in such a scare." The crowd, feeling the bound of the horses upon them, opened suddenly, just where the massing of people seemed most compact. There was an ugly lurch to right and left. Into the gap the horses trotted composedly, great intelligent creatures, with their instincts all alive to the harmless nature of the warfare, and then the police, wheeling them about, began gently pushing and thrusting the people back with the haunches of their beasts. And at the moment, through the opening thus made, a sudden vivid picture of the central struggle flashed itself to Honora's eyes. She saw a tall man without hat and with wildly tossed black hair and a deadly pale face, who defended himself by energetic gestures and a storm of words from the rough fellows who threatened and hustled him. She saw hands raised against him, clenched in his face or clutching at his clothes, and ugly open mouths howling derision about him. The man's shirt was torn open in the front, and his coat was half off his back. The face flashed to her as the face of a drowning man flashes through the waves in a last effort before sinking, white, full of concentrated endeavour, the muscles strained, the eyes gleaming, terrible but never unbeautiful, a thing to remember. The next moment he was ripped down like a shaken doll, and Honora saw nothing but the backs and limbs of half a dozen blue-coated policemen who were fighting over him, striking out at the crowd with truncheons, picking some valiant ruffian from the prostrate body of the orator and flinging him headlong away, thrusting back others with strong arms, and commanding everybody in hoarse shouts of angry authority. And then the crowd closed again, and the picture was lost. "He was down, Leslie," said Honora, quietly. "He will be killed." Before Lyttleton had time to reply and reassure her, the girl, to his unspeakable alarm and surprise, darted from his protective presence and ran straight into a particular part of the crowd, a part where the pressure and lurching seemed to him ugliest, and forcing her way through the mass with an energy and strength that astounded him, disappeared. Her action, following as it did upon the composure of her voice and bearing, was perfectly incomprehensible to him. Then suddenly he understood it, for, following in the direction she had taken, he caught a glimpse of her again. He saw her with her arm about the slight form of Lucilla, whom she was dragging towards the outskirts of the crowd. Perfectly composed, half a head taller than most, she was ingeniously elbowing and thrusting her way outwards, using her height and striking personality to assert authority, her strength now and then in a vigorous push or blow, her equable, calm voice in suave entreaty or command, and within 5 minutes she carried her friend straight out of peril into the open. Leslie ran up to her, a great emotion in his eyes. None of the three spoke. Honora gave a deep sigh of relief, that was all. Lucilla stood still with a dazed look. Then she began to pace up and down, her face full of an agony of trouble. Then she came close again to Honora's elbow. Lyttleton watched the two girls in silence. The amazement had not yet gone out of his heart. " Was he killed ?" asked she shortly of Honora. " I don't know," replied Honora as briefly. " I was too small to get there," began Lucilla in a troubled voice. " I was too small even to see. I am too small to do anything, Honora." "Yes," said Honora, "you are far too slight and tiny a thing. You ought just to stand outside." " It isn't his being killed that I'm minding," added Lucilla, with passionate vagueness. Lyttleton's presence had been forgotten. He gently reminded them of it. " There is Sheridan," he put in. " He is coming towards us. Perhaps he can tell us something." Sheridan, unconscious of the little scene, was walking towards them, his face rather excited, but a laugh on his lips. One or two others of the Socialist circle came up too. Amongst them all was a natural masculine effervescence of animal joy in a scrimmage which, after all, had passed off without broken bones. " He's all right," said Sheridan, laughing. " The crowd have suddenly changed their cue. He is being taken away to a place of safety under a strong escort of police. But the mob is going with him. They have turned it into a triumphal march now, and are irrelevantly singing Little Annie Rooney as they go along. They all want to shake hands with the man and swear eternal friendship." " Who is it ?" asked Honora. " A fellow called d'Auverney, a French anarchist. He was holding forth to an audience who had no manner of sympathy with him. They began making cat calls and shouting, ' 'E dun know where 'e are,' and ' Get yer 'air cut.' I suppose he did not understand these little amenities, for he persisted, and then they knocked him off his tub, and a kind of free fight began." " Was he hurt ?"" Oh, Lord, no. A torn shirt and a vanished hat was the worst." " It looked very serious for a moment," said Honora. " Well, of course they got their blood up at last, and it is a bit dangerous. The humours of a mob, with all their absurdity, lean that way. But he's not hurt." " I am glad of that." " Oh," said Sheridan, chuckling again, as the dying sounds of Annie Rooney and the cheerful measure of departing feet were heard from afar, " it is a very pretty bit of martyrdom for d'Auverney. It will be in all the papers to morrow. He scores, of course." Lucilla all this time had stood by Honora's side with drooping head and pale, silent lips. Suddenly she raised it, and her eyes, wide open and gleaming, darted upon Sheridan. A suffocating emotion oppressed her. A wild medley from all the turbulent thinking of the last 12 months rushed into her brain, each incoherent idea fighting for utterance, and scarcely one coming to the front clearly enough to be shaped into words. An agony of tears, not to be shed in the presence of these men, hung behind her eyelids. Sheridan caught sight of the eyes that held him. He took a step nearer, inclining his head in surprise. " Lucilla !" said he in his kindest tone. That shook speech from her. " Yes," said she, turning coldly from him. " You can laugh, for the laugh is on your side. They applauded you. They have beaten him. For my part, I believe most in the cause which the mob abuses." Sheridan's face changed quickly. He was bitterly hurt, and the sensitive quiver that passed over his strong features showed it, though the moment after he was looking towards Lucilla's retreating form with nothing but kindly self-reproach in his eyes. " I had no idea that I was paining her," said he apologetically to Honora. " I had no idea she was taking the matter seriously." During the last 6 months, in the crowded business of his active life, he had forgotten his interview with Lucilla and her interest in d'Auverney and the cause he had found for uneasiness on her account, accepting simply, as though it were too natural not to last, the later evidences of her full and happy allegiance to his own party. CHAPTER XV